Today, we have a really interesting guest. Her name is Stephanie Walker, and she wrote a book about the myths related to money. And in the book, she is actually dispelling a lot of the myths. And so in today's show, we want to take kind of like the top 4 or 5 of those myths and have Stephanie explain to us what she actually found, how much is actually true about it, but more importantly, how can we learn from dispelling these myths and actually really get to our time freedom point earlier. So let's welcome Stephanie Walker. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ideal Investor Show, where we bring you interesting guests to talk about how can you actually increase the amount of money, get to early retirement, and just all around have a better life. And today we have somebody who is going to help us dispel a bunch of myths, and not just dispel, she actually wrote the book about it. So Stephanie, welcome to the Ideal Investor Show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah, we are excited too. And so before we go into the details of the book and why you wrote it and what's in it and so forth, tell us a little bit, how did Stephanie get into this whole money stuff and financial stuff and so forth?
Well, I started like most people. Actually, I got a job straight out of college and realized not too long after that it wasn't for me, in the sense that I was getting a 2% raise. And I remember going to my dad, who is really my mentor. He was an entrepreneur his whole life. And he said, Stephanie, if you keep working the way you are now, you know what you're going to get. And it's dependent on other people. And if you want to do it yourself and become an entrepreneur, then your success is really up to you. So that's what I did. Quit the job 2 weeks later. I started in an insurance agency at that time and worked it for 16 years. But on the side, I was investing in single family rental properties in Denver. Didn't really have a lot of skills or knowledge about it, but just went ahead and bought it. And then in 2016, I was invited to a boot camp to learn about putting together commercial real estate deals, syndicated deals. And my eyes were open completely at that conference. It was that people are joining together to buy something much bigger than anyone can do on their own. So I was kind of sold on that idea. And also I raise money from wealthy investors. And so I noticed that the wealthy investors that I'm working with are doing things very different with their money than most people are. And that made me curious to learn more. And once I learned more, I started positioning my assets like the wealthy were doing with theirs. And within 3 or 4 years, I had replaced the income that my business was making, and I retired. And so
you mean retired from the insurance business, right?
Yep. I sold my business in 2001. And now my passion is talking to people about, these myths we're taught on how to invest our money. And it doesn't really give us a great retirement, or really doesn't get us to being a wealthy person.
Okay. And so may I ask, you said you realized by raising money from people who were already wealthy that they handled their money differently. Is that kind of where this dispelling of myth came from, or is that something different?
Nope. Yep. That's exactly, because I think when I looked at what the wealthy were doing, they're doing stuff that's very different from their mindset all the way to what they're doing on a daily basis. How they're viewing money is very different than how the average person in America does it.
Okay.
And yeah. I think people have to grasp some of these concepts and really take a look at what we're being taught and really understand that who's making money for you investing the way that everybody else does, because there is incentive for people to make money.
Yeah, obviously. Okay, cool. So I know you wrote the book about it, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. So can you say how many myths you were actually dispelling in there?
There's 10 myths.
Okay.
Yeah, 10 myths.
So can we maybe say, let's start with the top 5, and if we have some time left, we can maybe then get the bottom 5. What's the number 1 that you think you would want to mention for sure?
Well, for sure, the last myth that I mentioned in chapter 10 is the most impactful, I think, which is the taxes. Taxes are something that need to be addressed when you're thinking about your income. You have to always be mindful of what taxes are doing to your retirement income, and you have to find ways to mitigate them, because dealing with the taxes is huge. It's the largest eroder of wealth that we have.
So how would you put the myth itself then in words, or how did you put it in words?
That's a good question. Let me look real quick. There's nothing I can do about taxes. I owe in retirement.
Oh, okay, I get it. Okay, and so what did you learn from the wealthy? What do they do about taxes, if anything?
They definitely address their taxes. They know what the taxes are going to be when they invest in a deal, and they try to get the most benefits out of tax benefits when they invest in a deal. So I use the word tax treatment diversification, whereas most people think that they just have one way of handling taxes. Either you pay your taxes, or say I'm doing a 401k, I've deferred my taxes. That's it. They don't know anything beyond that. Well, there's many, many things beyond that. As far as if you invest in real estate, you know that there's always a good write-off if you're doing your real estate deals correctly. So that's always something that they're looking at. But I think what is even new to me, to be honest with you, is the wealthy actually engineer like a solution for their tax problem. So say they want tax-free income. They have actually engineered a solution of investing in high value life insurance, where a bank finances the life insurance for them. So they're using the leverage of the bank to put money into a life insurance policy, which is completely tax free. And it does two things for the investor. It gives them tax free income, and also it addresses the big elephant, which is the estate taxes that are coming in the US. The state taxes are changing. I believe it's in 2026 that the new estate taxes, it used to be that if you had an estate, you'd have to have an estate worth more than $12 million. Now that's been changed and it's gone down to $5 million. Mm-hmm. So what that means for a normal person is if you have an estate, which, you know, includes all your rental properties and all your investments, that totals over $5 million. Once the value has gone over $5 million, the government gets 40% at least. The federal government, that's not taking into consideration what the states will do on top of that. They are fully aware, the wealthy and their advisors, and they're always looking to mitigate their taxes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point. I mean, even in our name, Idea Wealth Grower, the D stands for depreciation. And that's just really a kind of like a bucket on all kinds of ways how you can either depreciate something faster by, you know, itemizing it when you buy a new property, and you can take all the different things with their life expectancy rather than the traditional 27.5 years or anything along those lines. So I think you're making a great point. And I think it's true that people get conditioned. That's one of my pet peeves, you know, that people are reacting to what the media are basically telling them, and the media is constantly telling them, you know, work hard and pay your taxes and then you will have a good life. And strangely, those that don't follow that seem to have a better life. You know?
Yes.
So exactly. I'm glad that you brought that one up. Yeah, that's actually a big one. I thought your first reaction, since you said you did single family like we do, it would be, you know, as an example, and I always bring this up, how you can actually also, that's just an alternative that I know some other wealthy people do as well, is just look at potential for 1031s, you know, whether you do it within syndication results or even if you own it outright, you know, that you know and actually plan for the fact that if you ever sell a property for whatever reason, that you just exchange it rather than just pocket the gains that you probably made. You know, the same thing with the rental cash flow and the positive cash flow that we're always advising people to generate. Well, if it balances with a depreciation, you're basically good to go, right? I mean,
Yes,
that's a pretty
exactly.
unbeatable deal. So cool. Now, that was the number 10, but top one from impact. Which other one would you like to mention?
I think the one that is surprising to most people is the myth that wealthy people became wealthy because they wanted to invest in high risk investments.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
actually, there's nothing further from the truth. The wealthy investors that I've worked with are some of the most conscious of how they're investing and investing in very low risk and tangible assets that give a cash flow. But they tend to invest in teams, with experience, whereas the average person goes out and puts money in their 401k. And if you ask them about one company that they have their money invested in, they wouldn't be able to tell you who the CEO is, what their past record has been, what their exit strategy is on this business, anything, a business plan, anything.
Yeah, totally with you on that. I mean, most of the time when you say which mutual funds does your servicer actually invest in, they don't know that either. If they can say,
Yeah.
okay, I'm with Vanguard or I'm with Fidelity or whatever, any one of those, that's already in most cases the most that you typically find out. Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. The thing that I find interesting in this kind of risk aspect, and I'm really curious what you would say about it, as I've basically kind of look at the arc of my investing career and life to some extent and work career, even though, I mean, I went to the military and then did 4 years of employee and thought, well, that's not my thing, and then started my business. So
Yeah.
my whole life I was basically first military service. I don't call that employment. That's a different kind of thing. And then 4 years employment and then my own company. But what I mean by looking at the arc is I find that similar to the conditioning that you were mentioning about Texas, I have the impression that there's more and more of this earning, almost yearning for instant gratification. And even if instant is not in hours or minutes or stuff like that, but in an investing context, to say, well, my whole plan collapses when I don't make fill in the blanks profit every year, right? And the associated risk with that. What's your take? What's your experience when it comes to comparing what the wealthy do to what people are basically being almost told they have to do to maximize gains?
Well, I had my series 6 and 7 when I was an insurance agent. So I have pretty firsthand knowledge of how you invest and how you're trained to invest other people's money. And the first questions you ask them is, how old are they? What's their experience in investing? What is their risk tolerance? And so it goes right to the thought that they have to invest most of their money, their principal, in risky options to make higher returns. And that is very opposite of what wealthy people do. Wealthy people, and it's a shame because I think that the average person has really abdicated their responsibility of their money, and they just turn it over to, their 401k or whatnot, where they don't know anything. Like, I got out of having my series 6 and 7. I think there was a drop. I think it was in 08, 09. No one saw that coming. Not any experienced financial planner that I had been working with knew that this was coming, And the thing is, the people, the customers lost lots of money. And I just feel it very random in the stock market. They said in the news this week that the Fed's thinking of raising interest rates again. And then, of course, then the stock market does its thing. But it all seems very random. Whereas like a wealthy person will look to invest in a company where he knows, like I said, the people, what they're wanting to do in this business, what they're wanting to achieve, what kind of cash flow are they going to be getting, those sorts of things. What has been their past track record? These speak very big volumes. And then they place their money in things that have very low risk, high return. They're looking for asymmetric returns, which is very different than what the average person is doing. They're looking to put their money in something that's going to have much higher returns than average with the lowest amount of risk.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually my experience too. And I mean, one thing that I would say from my observation is that people who, and I don't even want to necessarily say they have to be wealthy, but I would say if they're financially conscious, either because they took time to learn about it, or they got a mentor or coach, or they work with an organization like yours, I would call them kind of financially conscious. I think anybody, and I'm preaching this all the time, would say, I realize that whether I invest in a company with the attributes that you just mentioned, or I invest in something tangible like real estate, that these things have cycles that are way more than 90 days, which is kind of what the financial media wants to make us believe, right? A company sucks or is horrible suddenly from one day to the next because in their quarterly report, they didn't meet analyst expectations, which kind of train, I believe, the people to believe that a company is only worth something when it constantly grows, constantly has good news every 90 days, right? And I think anybody who is financially conscious knows, okay, if I want to have appreciation in real estate or cash flow or both, like what we are preaching, and I think you to some extent as well, whether you do it through syndication or you do it through residential single family homes, duplexes, triplexes, is basically to say, okay, I know that when this thing is appreciating or when my cash flow is based on the rental income, I have to have a certain time horizon, a certain level of patience, and not every 90 days go and look at which analyst was happy or which analyst wasn't happy, right? And so that's kind of my observation on that. I think that's really an important point. So maybe we have a third myth that you can bring up.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I was just writing down financially conscious. I like that. I like that term. I really do, because most people are very unconscious with their investing, which is a shame. But I'll go into that one.
Yeah, well, before you go, I just want to say why I use that, because I think there is some people use the term financially aware.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're aware of something, that doesn't necessarily yet mean you have some idea what you can do about it or what actions you want to take, which I think is really consciousness in that context is a little bit more advanced than just knowing I should do something, but then how do you do it? And that's why I'm always preaching. I think you and I would agree that if it's something that you haven't done before, or that you don't think that you have a certain level of mastery, then consciousness also means get a partner, get a team, get a family office, get Stephanie, get Axel, something like that, right?
Yeah, that's 100% true. So going off of that, I put, this one could be a little controversial, is that I put the 401k is a great retirement vehicle. That is my myth.
I was just I was just getting controversial with you, but I think I know where this is going.
Yeah. And I'll just back, and then several of the chapters sort of back this up in the sense of how many fees. I think it's a crazy number. It's in my book, but like 90 is be somewhere between 90 and 95% of people don't think any fees come out of their 401k.
Right.
And it's astounding. And we talk about that quote with Albert Einstein that the greatest miracle is compounding interest. What they're not addressing is compounding fees are super destructive to people's money. And if you're not aware of what these fees are doing, they could literally make you work another 20 years for the fees that get taken out over 20 or 30 years of your working life. But the larger part of it is that I see, the financial plans, the financial statements of my wealthy people. They have about maybe a third of their money in the stock market. And most of them, they pick the stocks or whatnot. But let's just say, for comparison's sake, they are market related assets. The rest of their 2/3 of their investments are in non-market related assets. So that's where I would ask someone who has a 401k, they'll say, oh yeah, I'm diversified. No, you're not diversified because you have everything in market assets, right? That's a huge thing. So, people are always like, how do you get out of it? But
absolutely. I agree with you on that one. I mean, I hear And I think that probably comes from your research for your book and the experience you have with working with people like that. And to some extent, not to the extent you have it, but to some extent, I oftentimes, when we have the mentoring and coaching sessions that we do, we obviously ask questions of how did you actually advance? Because most of the time it's not necessarily 20 and early 30-year-olds, but slightly more mature people. And when I ask them questions, it's not oftentimes that they really deliberately do certain things, but because their employer told them, or everybody in the family always did it, or I saw it in the media. And this aspect in the context of 401k and the fees, I oftentimes say, okay, you are aware it's not a performance fee, right? It's just an existing fee. So whether they do well for you, in your opinion, or they suck like last year, where most of them lost like 25 to 30% of what you had, they still get the fee, right? So, I mean, normally you would say, I pay somebody who is actually performing, but no, in this case, you pay no matter what. The other thing that I want to ask you, I've asked this before, but since you brought up the myth about the 401k, to me, I think one of the aspects to consider is that the 401k only exists just barely long enough for people to really start experiencing retirement age, with 401k matured basically to what it was originally said to be. Mm-hmm. And I'm really curious about your opinion on this part of the myth that says, okay, you're doing this deferment because your taxes will be lower when you retire. What's your thought about it? Because I'm always telling people, how do you think that an ever-growing number of retirees versus an ever smaller number of people is going to be able that the small number of people can keep your taxes at or lower than what they are today?
That's a great point. Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I deal with this in the tax chapter, in which I really I think it's obvious, but actually I think for most people it isn't obvious, because their financial planner, like I said, had an insurance agency. I did advise people with their money, but then I didn't, but I would still talk to people and they would be like, oh, well, my financial planner told me, no big deal. We'll just defer it. Makes most sense to do it. But what they don't realize is they lose some of I think 3 of their largest deductions they lose, which is investing in your 401k. You get the deduction for that. Your house. Hopefully most people would have their houses paid for at that time, or their children. They may have children still living at home, but they can't claim them as dependents.
Yeah, exactly.
And so there they've lost the 3 biggest deductions. Now let's talk about how high taxes have been historically. And do you know, or does anyone know, if taxes are higher or lower than they've been in the last 40 years? Actually, they're some of the lowest tax rates we've had in the last 40 years. I heard Biden was talking about having a tax on the 400,000 people making 400,000 or more. And, it's not going to affect the little guy, blah, blah, blah. But the higher taxes are coming. We just can't keep spending the way that we do. If you want to go and look at something fun, go to, I think it's US Debt Clock. Yeah. And that shows you our debt. But what's more interesting is the Social Security and the Medicare unfunded liability, which means these are true costs, that are coming through to us that we cannot cover. So when Social Security first got rolled out, you'll have to excuse me, I don't remember exactly. It was maybe 40 or 50 workers for one person. Right. Now we're at, I think it's a little over 3. Or it might be closer to 2 to 1. And so that means that, 40 or 50 people were paying the Social Security benefits for one person. Now we've got 2 people paying for one person. So all these things calculate to me that higher taxes are going to be in the future for sure. And deferring is not, at least if you're really stuck with deferring, defer part, and then take a part of your money and invest it like the wealthy do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm totally with you on that. And just to kind of pile on that argument, I think if you look at the performance of the managed money versus either self-managed or invested in tangible assets over time, because everybody is saying, oh, you need to start as early as possible, and then you do it for 35 years. for your 401k. Well, if you were to look at any other of the tangible asset classes for that equal amount of time, it's typically off the chart better, especially when it's not managed by somebody who has those fees that you mentioned. The other thing, my point on that part is, you mentioned the usdebtclub.org, where people can go and see kind of like the counter run. What I find is kind of interesting when we look at the current situation where the Fed has increased the rates basically eightfold. And this is eightfold for the government, because the government had 0 to 0.5%. Now they're at 4.5%. So that's 7, 8, 9-fold. And they just, like you said, threatened this week that in a few weeks they're going to add another 0.5%, which is another basically twofold increase over the original rate. So that means on those 31 trillion that we already have in debt, even if we wouldn't add anything anymore, the payment is going to be $1 trillion a year. And when you look, in my opinion, at how much really does the government have to move around that's not already given to Medicare and Social Security and other programs, it's about that, or not much more than that. So if all of that now, due to the higher interest rates, goes into basically debt service, then the government can do nothing anymore. Right. And I just don't see that, any politician who, in my opinion, the main thing they want to do is show that they did something, not so much whether it's good or bad, but something. And most of the time it involves money. Then in that context, they just have no other choice than to raise taxes just to have more income, because the expense side is not going to change very favorably anytime soon. Right. So that other part is totally, I think, forgotten, that we have so much debt that we're not going to get down from. I don't think we're going to ever have a surplus again.
No. Not when some people in the government are like, spending, we can't cut a dime. Like, who can't cut a dime from their, I mean, like, I can cut a dime from my, there is excessive spending.
Yeah, absolutely. But even if you were to say you're not increasing at all anymore, that's still no surplus, right? Yeah. So and 31 trillion, and I think some projections I saw is going to go up to 50 trillion in the next 5 years or something. These numbers are so outlandishly large that nobody can really relate to them anymore. Yeah. But the fact is, it's still a system where if you borrow money, you have to pay interest on it. And if the people that you put in charge keep increasing interest, then what you have to pay, it's the same like for you and me. If we get a mortgage and we right now get it for 7 or 8% versus it used to be 3 or 4%, well, we pay twice as much on interest. It's not that hard, right? Okay, well, enough ranting about 401k. Let's do one more, one more myth.
I think this one is, it goes along the same line, but real estate investing is risky. I have a lot of people that think that real estate investing is risky, or they hear stories like, I hear stories like this all the time. I know I was one of these people that was out there trying to figure out stuff on my own. But actually in 2012, the Jobs Act that was passed by Obama actually allows crowdfunding, which is a big word, big fancy word for, I can go out, I can talk on your show, I can write a book about it, I can put stuff on my website about raising money. Prior to 2012, the only way that deals like syndicated deal, which I'm saying is like a big apartment complex, say 100-unit apartment complex, we get part of our down payment from our investors, and then the investors get paid cash flow, and the property is managed by a good team with a good track record. And again, when we say what our results are, we are saying that after our fees are taken. So that's very different, the stock market where they're saying 8%, but then that's just not going to include your fees. So that is a low way of investing, a low risk way of investing, a low work way of investing, once you've really looked at who you're investing with and what you're investing in. And if I'd never known that when I was investing in single family rentals, so a lot of people think, oh, I can't be a landlord, or I don't want to do the property management thing. But there is this group of investments that are very good and have been used by the wealthy for years. Prior to 2012, these deals were only available to people who say I would have a relationship with, had a prior relationship with. So this really lent itself to these deals being passed around at a country club or something like that.
Right, yeah.
So the wealthy really had them for years. So this isn't new to the wealthy, but it is new to the middle class, working, busy professional who doesn't have time to buy real estate. And of course, with this type of investing, you get great tax benefits with it because you actually own the real estate asset.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way, especially, even though for Idea Wealth Grower, try to help people to become literally the owners like you. I'm assuming you still own your residential properties, your single families. So that's one way. But if somebody says, I want to be even more passive, I think syndication is definitely a great way to go. And if they want to know more about it, I went to your website and I saw that you have all kinds of stuff. Now you have the logo behind you while we're recording, and people who see us on YouTube, they can basically see the logo. Now, I have to ask you something, and there's a little bit of a cheeky thought behind it, but Erbe Wealth, where does that come from?
Erbe Wealth. Erbe is the German word for legacy. So I did that because my father, he passed away in 2005. He never saw my success to this degree. And he was my biggest mentor. And he was a second generation German immigrant. So I wanted to give him a nod in the name of my company. So
okay, yeah, that's very cool. I would actually contest the interpretation. It's a little bit a loose interpretation of the word Erbe because I'm from Germany native.
Right? Yeah.
So I wouldn't call it legacy. I would call it inheritance, but it's not totally unrelated.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, if you say, in German, I inherited a house, you would say, ich habe ein Haus geerbt. So Erbe is literally, but yeah, legacy is good. It's kind of a stretch, a little bit.
A little bit of a stretch.
Yeah,
I should have talked to you when I was looking at the German word for legacy, but that's what came up when
actually, even though I said it's a little bit of a stretch, the German, if you were to go literal with the word, it's not quite as nice a word as legacy. In the way, some words, even though they have a certain meaning, but they also have a connotation. So the German word, if you ever want to look at it, is Vermächtnis, which is basically more kind of like, I'm hesitant to say it, is kind of like the stuff I left you.
Okay.
Right? Which obviously, if it's real estate and investment stuff and so forth, is great and is positive, and the next generation can do something. But it can also be all kinds of like a pile of stuff that you don't necessarily, right? Like, so Vermächtnis is the true kind of more closer translation to legacy.
That sounds a lot harder to pronounce than
yeah, you wouldn't want to put that in the logo anyway. so Erbe is much better. But I was kind of intrigued by that because you could, if you want to spin it, if I had to spin it, I would say, okay, well, that's what you really want to do is you want to build an inheritance, from a wealth perspective that allows your, kin and their children to have something to draw from. And especially if you put it in a trust, which I'm assuming, estate planning in a trust is kind of what you would recommend. So ultimately, if you give good rules for how to run the trust, it should last for generations, right?
Forever.
In that sense, inheritance is not such a bad idea, and legacy obviously kind of, and if the third generation later says, hey, it's grandpa's legacy or grandpa's legacy or Stephanie's legacy or something like that. Cool. Yeah, I wanted to just ask that because I couldn't quite make exactly the connection, but now I understand it. Thanks for sharing.
Good.
Okay, cool. So when we come to the podcast, end of the podcast, I always ask the same two questions, and they're not really related to investing. The first one is, if you could meet anybody, past or present, who would it be and why?
Wow. Meet anyone, past or present. I actually would have liked to have met Ronald Reagan when I was so young when he was president, but I felt like he really inherited a bit of a mess, and he really seemed to be fiscally responsible. And I've always sort of looked at him as someone who I'd like to at least sit down and have a chat with.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if I came along, I would probably ask if he was aware that the lowering of taxes would boost the level of innovation as much as it did.
Yeah.
Right, because I think that connection was a great one. Nowadays, everything seems to be so focused on the financial side exclusively, almost exclusively. And I think he really had the intention to say, if I lower the burden, then people will basically start applying themselves and be innovative and blossom and bloom, which it did. Right? I mean, the economy had a great boost after he got the laws passed for the tax reductions. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing is, I would ask him, how did you stay safe in your cowboy movies? Because somehow that doesn't seem to be the case.
But actually, rolling it back to our taxes, when he was enacting in California, I read this somewhere, he would only do one movie a year, because if he made over $100,000, he went into the 90% tax bracket that they had at the time. So he would only do one movie a year to avoid that.
Yeah, understood. No, I mean, taxes were crazy high and people don't really want to acknowledge it anymore. And it's a little bit weird. It's there are certain things, and I don't want to go in that rabbit hole, but there are certain things where people seem to want to deny history.
Yeah.
And that's only one of them. Okay, so the other and last question for all our podcast guests is, if you had a time machine, Stephanie, you could go forward, backward, anywhere you wanted. You know what you know. You can't obviously change history, but where would you go and why?
Oh, wow. I would love to, I guess, go back to maybe my teenage years, which would have been in the 80s, and had the knowledge of, I had an intern this last summer, and she's 21, and I was just like, oh, what I couldn't have done, what I would have done at 21 had I had the knowledge I have now, as opposed to, and then I could see, some family members that I've lost since. But yes, yeah, applying these principles when I'm in my early 20s, as opposed to being mid 40, I think is when I changed some stuff around in my life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think we are, as much as time machine would be cool, but we can't really change what we did in our life. But I personally find one of the most gratifying things in Ideal Wealth Grower, what we do, is the actual mentoring. Because, and I'm sure you felt something like that when you worked with your intern, is when they have these aha moments and they start changing their behavior and they actually start understanding. I find that so gratifying. It's almost like the thing about the credit card, right? It's priceless. You can't really put money. So, absolutely. All right, cool. Stephanie, thank you so much. It was a really fun conversation. So before we end, you want to tell people what they should do with your website about the book?
Oh, yeah, you can go to my website. It's www.airbaywealth.com. Then do a /shattering/money-myths. I'll send it to you, and maybe you can post it in.
Yeah, we put it in the show notes, so anybody either on YouTube, or if they see us on Apple or Spotify or anywhere, they find it in the show notes, so you can just click on it and it gets you right there.
And I'll be giving your audience the free books if they want me to mail them to them, or they could get the download.
Okay, that's very generous. Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie, for that.
Sure.
And so for anybody who sees us on YouTube, when this comes out, please give it a thumbs up if you liked it, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And if you actually hear us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or any of these other platforms, I guess, please give us a rating and a review, because that helps us to actually keep doing this show. So thanks again, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Ideal Investor Show. More info and the links we mentioned during the show are in the show notes, or you can go to our website at idealwealthgrower.com and sign up for the Apple Podcast link. And if you like to talk to me, sign up for a strategy call. Hopefully you want to share what you learned with your network and bring more people in. We are really eager to hear your comments. And until next time, be well, stay safe, and ciao.